Explosions reported in southern Iran. Rubio says Strait of Hormuz must remain open. And Iran says sovereignty over Hormuz key to future U.S. deal. p.m. Cairo local time, and here are the news in detail. Explosions were reported in southern Iran hours after U.S. military announced strikes on Iranian targets in the Gulf region. Iranian media reported multiple explosions in the southern port city of Bandar Abbas, as well as nearby coastal areas in Hormuz province. The cause of the blasts was not immediately clear. Earlier, U.S. Central Command said American forces struck missile launch sites and mine-laying boats in southern Iran, describing the attacks as self-defense operations aimed at protecting U.S. troops from Iranian threats. U.S. President Donald Trump linked ongoing tensions with Iran to national security during Memorial Day remarks at Arlington National Cemetery. Speaking alongside Vice President J.D. Vance and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Trump paid tribute to fallen American service members during the annual Memorial Day observance. The U.S. President said those who died in service helped ensure what he described as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism would never obtain a nuclear weapon. His remarks come amid continued tensions between Washington and Tehran and ongoing debate over possible future military action against Iran.
Epic fury, we lost 13 wonderful souls.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the Strait of Hormuz must remain open following fresh American strikes on Iran.
The straits have to be open. They're going to be open one way or the other. So they need to be open. What's happening there is unlawful, it's illegal, it's unsustainable for the world, it's unacceptable. I don't know of any country in the world that does it. The Russians are not in favor of a tolling system. The Chinese are not in favor of a tolling system. I mean, there's no country in the world that's in favor of a tolling system except the regime in Iran. So that's not acceptable. That cannot happen. The straits need to be open, unimpeded, without tolls, and obviously that needs to happen immediately as soon as anything's agreed to.
An Iranian official said Tehran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz is essential to any future agreement with the United States. Ibrahim Azizi, head of the Iranian Parliament's National Security Committee, said the strategic waterway is not negotiable in the same way as Iran's nuclear file. His remarks came as optimism grew in global markets over the possibility of a U.S.-Iran agreement that could reopen the Strait of Hormuz and ease regional tensions. Oil prices fell sharply on Monday despite both Washington and Tehran downplaying expectations of an immediate breakthrough in negotiations. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said dozens of commercial vessels passed through the Strait of Hormuz with Iranian authorization over the past day. The naval arm of Iran's Revolutionary Guard said 32 vessels, including oil tankers and container ships, crossed the Strait of Hormuz within 24 hours after receiving permission from Iranian authorities. Iranian officials also indicated the strategic waterway could be reopened in phases following months of heightened restrictions and military tensions. Armenian Iranian officials held talks on freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz amid ongoing regional tensions and diplomatic efforts. The talks in Muscat were led by Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi and Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Qasem Gabri-Babadi. According to Oman's foreign ministry, both sides discussed maritime security, trade flows, and the principle governing navigation through the Strait of Hormuz under international law. Omani officials also received a message from Iran regarding ongoing talks with the United States through Pakistani mediation, with both sides reaffirming commitment to restoring safe navigation in the strategic waterway. Iran said it has reached understandings with the United States on several issues in ongoing negotiations, but warned a final agreement is not close. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baqai said Tehran and Washington have made progress on many points related to efforts aimed at ending the war. However, Baqai stressed that no imminent agreement should be expected as major issues remain unresolved. He also said Iran is collecting fees for navigational services from vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz, insisting the charges should not be described as tolls. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he and US President Donald Trump agreed that any final deal with Iran must eliminate Tehran's nuclear threat. In a post on X, Netanyahu said he spoke with President Trump and agreed that Iran's uranium enrichment facilities and enriched nuclear materials must be dismantled and removed. The Israeli Prime Minister said both leaders also discussed efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and ongoing negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Netanyahu added that Trump reaffirmed Israel's right to defend itself on all fronts, including Lebanon. Meanwhile, Iran said current negotiations are focused on ending the war rather than discussing nuclear issues. Chinese President Xi Jinping met Pakistani Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif in Beijing as diplomatic efforts to formally end the Iran war continue. The high-level meeting followed Sharif's earlier talks with Chinese Premier Li Qiang during his official visit to China. The discussions come as Pakistan continues playing a central mediation role between Washington and Tehran, alongside several regional and international partners. Chinese and Pakistani officials have both emphasized support for diplomacy and efforts aimed at restoring regional stability and securing maritime routes in the Strait of Hormuz. China said dialogue and negotiation remain the only solution to the Iran crisis, warning that the use of force leads to a dead end. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning welcomed ongoing ceasefire efforts and negotiations between Washington and Tehran, saying regional stability depends on political solutions rather than military actions. Mao stressed the importance of reopening shipping lanes and restoring stability in the Middle East and the Gulf region as soon as possible. She added that China will continue working with the international community to support peace talks and promote a lasting settlement to the crisis. For more analysis, we now move to Hani Saif in our newsroom. Good morning, Hani.
Good morning, Mona. Ladies and gentlemen, we're joined from London by the research scholar at the University of Oxford and independent political risk analyst, Mr. Muhammad Ali Zafar. Mr. Zafar, welcome to Q News. Now, Pakistan has become the main mediator between Washington and Tehran. How difficult is it now to prevent negotiations from collapsing and the conflict from returning to open war?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I think it's really important that Pakistan keeps its nerves tight and makes sure that it is able to find a solution between these two sides, because conflict will erupt and there could be escalation of the conflict, which is possible. And even today we got to know about the news that US struck Iran as well. So although it says that it is for the defensive reason, but still, a strike on Iran means that it could actually damage the ongoing negotiation process as well, which is something which we will be looking forward into in the next 24 hours. So Pakistan's role is quite tough. Pakistan's field marshal has been taking trips to Tehran, and then there have been several ongoing calls between Pakistan and Middle Eastern partners, making sure that both sides do not escalate the conflict, which could raise a lot of challenges for the energy markets as well, for the commodity prices and the supply chain issue as well. If the situation escalates.
Well, President Donald Trump keeps saying the military action against Iran is still possible, and it is possible within days. Do you believe Washington is genuinely preparing for strikes, or is this just maximum pressure diplomacy?
Well, if you would have asked me this question a day before, I would have said that it is part of a maximum pressure diplomacy or maximum pressure policy. This was in place after the failure of JCPOA talks between US and Iran, and after that, everything has been part of the maximum pressure policy, including these threats of a unified strike from the US against Iranian assets. But one thing is for sure is that for now, US has actually struck Iran, although saying that it is for defensive reason, trying to protect its servicemen who are trying to protect the sea lanes. But the point is that the credibility of US threat still exists. But if the US strikes Iran, this will open a front where, although at first this was a conflict where Middle Eastern partners were saying that they want to de-escalate the situation, but obviously for Iran, the easier targets would be US bases in Middle Eastern countries. So I think that could really escalate the situation, and that would be a terrible point for the Middle Eastern future as well.
Well, Iran on its part announced a controlled maritime zone in the Strait of Hormuz. How dangerous is this situation now for global shipping, the energy market, and the Gulf stability in general?
Well, if Iran and Oman decides to control the Strait of Hormuz jointly, it will mean some sort of stability as well, where some of Iran's concerns would be agreed. But what US is expecting is complete opening of Strait of Hormuz, where Iran does not tax any ship that crosses through the Strait of Hormuz. I think this is a bone of contention as well in this first round of negotiations, because everyone is looking towards this idea of when will the Strait of Hormuz be completely open. So I think in that regard, the situation is quite critical for the global shipping and energy markets and for stability in the Gulf region as well.
There have been reports indicating that Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu are closely coordinating on the Iranian file, despite their differences on their diplomacy. Now, how aligned are Washington and Tel Aviv at this stage?
Well, despite some of the reports saying that there is some sort of differences between Trump and Netanyahu, I still believe that they both are on the same page. And I think one way to see it is the recent tweet by Donald Trump, in which he said that if this deal with Iran is possible, then he would like these Middle Eastern states, especially in which he mentioned Saudi Arabia and others as well, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and others, to join the Abraham Accord. So that is a point which which will provide some sort of relief to Israel as well, because Israel will like the idea of normalization of ties with Middle Eastern states. So I think that is something that Trump is offering to Netanyahu as part of this deal, because otherwise Netanyahu would not have preferred an end to the Iranian war. Rather, he would have preferred a continuation of war where more of Iran's proxy networks across Middle East will be targeted. At the same time, there will be more massive strikes on Iran's ballistic missile programs facilities as well. So I think that is something which Israel would have expected. And for now, what Trump has done is that he's saying that we can have a Abraham Accord sort of situation where more of these Middle Eastern partners can join it. And that is one of the way he's trying to move around Netanyahu and please him as well.
Well, the sticking point seems to be the Iranian issue, the uranium nuclear issue. Now, the Iranian officials are insisting that talks should prioritize on ending the war and lifting the sanctions, and the US continues focusing on the nuclear issue. Now, can these two positions somehow realistically meet?
Well, I definitely agree with you that it's really difficult that realistically these 2 points can work along, side by side. But the reality is that US has a very strict line. Iran cannot have nuclear technology and enriched uranium in place as well. And the other thing is the complete opening of the Strait of Hormuz as well. So lifting of sanctions and all those things, US wants guarantees from Iran that these talks about nuclear issues should remain the foremost priority of the US, because US has said clearly, how can it lift sanctions, discuss about state of Hormuz while sidelining the idea of nuclear issue for later discussions. So I think in that regard, US is really point blank clear about these things, how it wants the things to move forward, and the nuclear issue should remain at the forefront.
Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir recently traveled to Tehran as mediation efforts intensified. What specific role is Islamabad now playing behind the scenes?
I think Pakistan's role in this regard is, other than providing, as a good, acting as a good mediator, Pakistan will be trying to convince Iran that there should be effort to de-escalate the situation, and some sort of an agreement is reached between the two sides. As per one statement from Marco Rubio, there is discussions about the language of the agreement. So I think we are really close to it, and in that regard, Pakistan's role, and especially the Pakistan's Chief of Defense Forces, Saeed Asim Munir, his role has been quite critical, and everyone is recognizing it. But the point is, his messaging would be really clear that if this sort of agreement is not reached, then this conflict could escalate. And now, and these Middle Eastern states who were previously trying to prevent this situation and making effort for de-escalation, if Iran does launch attacks and if this situation escalates, then Iran would definitely try to attack the basis of Middle Eastern states, of US bases in Middle Eastern states. So that will make this conflict an existential crisis for the Middle Eastern states as well. And then they might work together against this Iran attack. So I think that's some sort of messaging will be given by Pakistan to Iran, that try to de-escalate the situation, and everyone wants to work with you right now. So let's take a deal.
Well, for its part, Iran is also warning of new regional fronts. If military action does resume, how concerned should the region be about escalation spreading to Lebanon, Iraq, or the Gulf, especially that Iran made that statement?
Well, definitely, if the situation escalates, it could have repercussions and for Middle Eastern states. So there is no doubt in that. But we all should hope for the best in terms of the idea that peace is given a chance in Middle East, and the efforts that have been started from Pakistan's side, it is actually materialized. This is something we should be expecting.
In your opinion, what would be the most likely scenario moving forward? A temporary diplomatic breakthrough, limited military escalation, or a broader regional confrontation?
I think the idea of broader regional confrontation is something we all do not want to see, and this is the least likely option. The most important thing is that we will see a diplomatic breakthrough, hopefully, and I think in that regard, the best option is that opening of Strait of Hormuz and some sort of an agreement that for 50 days, 60 days, something like that, we both sides agree to work along with each other and solve the nuclear issue as well, because obviously nuclear issue requires a lot of technicalities as well, so that cannot be solved within 2 weeks. I think there will be discussions in this regard, and some sort of memorandum of understanding being reached between the two sides.
From London, that was Mr. Muhammad Ali Zafar, the research scholar at the University of Oxford and independent political risk analyst. Mr. Zafar, thank you very much, sir, for joining us here on Q News. Ladies and gentlemen, now hand you back to Mona Msalhi in our studio. Mona.
Thank you so much, Hani, for the analysis. And millions of Muslims from around the world are gathering today on the plains of Arafat in the spiritual climax of the annual Hajj pilgrims. From dawn until sunset, pilgrims devote the day to prayer, reflection, and supplication in what is considered the most sacred stage of Hajj, known as the Day of Arafat. We now take you live to the holy site for a closer look at the atmosphere and rituals unfolding there. What we are witnessing now is the Day of Arafat, the most significant day of the Hajj, and one regarded by Muslims as a day of mercy, forgiveness, and spiritual renewal. Since the early hours of the morning, pilgrims dressed in white ihram garments have been arriving at Mount Arafat and the surrounding plains, spending the day in prayer and recitation of Quran. The ritual of standing at Arafat is considered the central pillar of Hajj. Islamic traditions holds that without standing at Arafat, the pilgrimage is not complete. Pilgrims remain here from noon until sunset, raising their hands in prayer and seeking forgiveness in an atmosphere marked by deep spirituality and emotions. Saudi authorities have deployed extensive medical security and logistical services to manage the massive crowds, while cooling station, water distribution points and transportation systems are operating throughout the area amid high temperatures. Later today, after sunset, pilgrims will begin moving towards Muzdalifah, where they will spend the night before continuing the next stages of Hajj, including the symbolic starting ritual in Mina and the Eid al-Adha celebrations. The day of Arafat also holds deep significance for Muslims worldwide, many of whom observe fasting and spend the day in worship, even if they are not performing Hajj. And as you can see from these live pictures, the atmosphere here remains calm, emotional, and deeply spiritual as Armenians unite in one of the world's largest annual religious gatherings. Great days indeed. And while diplomacy surrounding Iran's nuclear program and the Strait of Hormuz remains under intense international pressure, another dangerous front tied closely to the wider regional crisis continues to escalate in Lebanon, where Israeli strikes, Hezbollah activity, and fragile ceasefire efforts are keeping tensions at a boiling point.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Emergency teams inspected damage in southern Lebanon after Israeli strikes hit Nabatieh and nearby areas amid renewed evacuation warnings. Footage showed first responders surveying damaged sites in the southern Lebanese city of Nabatieh following Israeli airstrikes. The Israeli military issued evacuation warnings for residents in 10 villages, most of them in southern Lebanon, ahead of expected attacks targeting what it described as Hezbollah positions. These strikes come amid continued escalation along the Lebanon-Israel border despite ongoing ceasefire efforts. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he ordered increased military pressures on Hezbollah in Lebanon. Netanyahu said Israel has established a special team focused on countering Hezbollah drones amid continued cross-border escalation. The Israeli Prime Minister also claimed Israeli forces killed 600 Hezbollah members over recent weeks as operations intensified in southern Lebanon. His remarks came as Israeli strikes and Hezbollah attacks continue despite ongoing ceasefire efforts.
לא יצאנו החוצה. היום אנחנו שולטים, כמה? היום זה 60%.
The Israeli military announced tighter restrictions on public gatherings near the Lebanese border amid fears of possible Hezbollah attacks. The Israeli military said updated Home Front Command instructions now prohibit gatherings of more than 50 people in areas close to the Lebanese frontier. The measures come as Israeli authorities prepare for possible attacks by Hezbollah following continued escalation along the border.
Donald John Trump can solemnly swear. If you look at that, or we're out.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio that Moscow is carrying out what it described as systematic strikes on Ukrainian military facilities in Kyiv. According to the Russian Foreign Ministry, Lavrov informed Rubio during a phone call that the strikes were ordered in response to alleged Ukrainian attacks on civilians and infrastructure inside Russia. Lavrov also urged the United States and foreign diplomatic missions to ensure the evacuation of diplomatic staff and other citizens from the Ukrainian capital amid the escalating security situation. The World Health Organization warned that the Ebola outbreak in Congo is spreading faster than health teams can contain it. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said the outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo has now resulted in more than 900 suspected cases and 220 suspected deaths. In Bundibugyo, strain of Ebola has also spread in Uganda, where several confirmed cases and one death have been reported. Tedros warned that health authorities are struggling to keep pace with the rapidly moving outbreak, particularly as there are currently no approved vaccines or treatments for the virus strain involved. Protesters clashed with police in Bolivia's capital, La Paz, as anti-government demonstrations entered their fourth week. Labor unions, miners, transport workers and rural groups continue pressing President Rodrigo Paz to resign amid anger over austerity measures and rising living costs. Road blockades have caused major shortages of food, fuel and medicine in La Paz, neighboring El Alto. In an effort to calm tensions, Paz announced he would cut his salary and the salaries of cabinet ministers in half. Meanwhile, coca growers linked to former President Evo Morales gathered near a military base in the Chapare region, warning security forces against acting against civilians. Soccer fans gathered in Toronto for a rare chance to see the FIFA World Cup trophy ahead of next year's tournament. Former Italian defender and World Cup winner Alessandro Nesta unveiled the iconic 18-carat gold trophy during its global promotional tour ahead of the tournament kick-off. Hundreds of fans gathered outside Toronto City Hall to take photos with the trophy as excitement builds across one of the host cities. Officials say the World Cup is expected to further boost the popularity of football in Canada, where the sport continues to grow rapidly among young players. That's all for now, but before we go, let's have a look at the top headlines making news this hour. Explosions reported in southern Iran. Rubio says Strait of Hormuz must remain open. And Iran says sovereignty over Hormuz key to future US deal. That brings us to the end of this bulletin. Many thanks for watching Qnews, your window to the latest developments from across the region and around the world.